What's the one thing you'd say to your younger self before your first betrayal?
At my own wedding reception, with plates still half full and glasses not even emptied once, my mother stood up beside the microphone like she was hosting a fundraiser and, with that calm voice she uses when she thinks she is being reasonable, announced that they would be taking the wedding gift money for safekeeping because my sister needed it for her baby, and the way she said it made it sound like a family policy rather than a grab in front of everyone who had just watched me promise a whole life to the man sitting next to me. I did not argue, because I learned a long time ago that arguing with my parents is like running on sand. You burn energy and end up nowhere while they congratulate themselves on keeping the peace, so I just smiled and felt Ethan's hand press the back of my chair. Steady and warm, and the table around us went strangely quiet in that way people do when they want to pretend they did not hear something ugly. And then my sister Jenna gave me that sympathetic face she reserves for when she is about to take something of mine and call it family love. If you want to understand why I smiled, you need to know that this was not a slip, not a bad choice of words, not even a one-off lapse in judgment. This was muscle memory for my parents. Because for years they've been moving goalposts and rewriting rules so that Jenna could be the center of every plan, every emergency, every rescue, while I got speeches about independence and grit and how learning to do it on my own would make me strong. And I did do it on my own. I paid my own way, I handled my own bills, I learned to stop asking, and they learned that I would never make a scene. When I was finishing school and needed a small bridge to cover the last few months of rent, they explained that times were tight, and I should pick up extra hours, and a week later Jenna got a used car that my father called an investment in family logistics. And when I needed a dental procedure that insurance barely touched, my mother told me the timing was unfortunate, and 2 months later Jenna had a baby shower that looked like a small pop-up store, and every time I brought any of this up, I was told that keeping score is a poison, and that I should be proud of my resilience, which is just a prettier way to say you are on your own. So when my mother announced, in front of relatives who flew in and friends who had known me since I was the one who stayed late to clean up other people's messes, that they would handle the gift money because my sister needed it more than we did, the room did that uncomfortable shuffle where people check their napkins and pretend to cough, and I watched my father nod along like a banker approving a transfer, and I felt the old anger scratch at the door, but I did not open it, because for the first time in my life, I was not stuck reacting to them. I was already 2 steps ahead. We had seen this coming, not the exact script, but the shape of it, because during the planning there were hints, small comments about how young families need a head start, about how gift funds should be handled by adults with experience, about how Jenna's due date meant the universe had arranged a natural handoff, and every time I brushed it off, Ethan would look at me the way a good partner looks when he knows you are minimizing something that is about to hurt you again. A week before the wedding, we split the registry into 2 parts, a normal public list like everyone expected, and a private account with automatic deposit for any cash gifts, which meant that envelopes at the reception were mostly cards with notes and a few checks that would go through our bank app before dessert, and we arranged with the venue manager a locked intake box and a simple chain of custody. Nothing dramatic, nothing showy. Just ordinary adult boundaries that no one could argue with. Unless they were planning to argue with basic responsibility, and I told exactly 2 people outside of our planner, because secrets leak in families like mine. So when my mother made her announcement and some guests nodded because the phrasing sounded generous and protective, I just reached into my clutch and scrolled to a short message labeled Plan B. Not because anything had gone wrong, but because I wanted the manager to tighten the chain, and within minutes the decorated card box on the table was replaced with a decoy that looked identical and held nothing but blank place cards, while the real locked box went straight to the office safe with a logged handoff and a photo timestamp, and the coordinator gave me the tiniest nod from across the room that told me the switch was complete and the money that my parents believed they could scoop up was already out of their reach. I turned back to the table and said, very politely, that if they felt strongly about it they were welcome to coordinate with the venue, because we wanted everything documented and simple. And my mother smiled, that tight smile that says she thinks I am being difficult, and my father launched into a speech about family trust, and Jenna chimed in with a line about how babies are expensive and weddings are just parties. And I let them talk while I sipped water and counted my breaths, because once I was not pleading for fairness, I was managing a situation that I had rehearsed quietly in my head for months, and the old urge to explain myself just melted away. My mother finished with something about doing what is best for everyone, and I nodded and thanked her for caring, and then I caught Ethan's eye and he stood up slowly, reached into his jacket, and walked toward my parents with an envelope that looked exactly like the kind of thing they believed they were entitled to manage. And as he placed it into my mother's hand, I felt the room lean forward the way a room leans when it senses a turn it did not anticipate, and I kept my smile because I wanted them to remember it later. Since inside that envelope was not what they thought it was, and the moment they opened it would be the moment everything they have ever said about fairness and family finally met the truth, which is where I am going to take you next. If you had been sitting at that reception and watching me smile while my mother calmly announced that she and my father would be taking care of the wedding gift money for Jenna's baby, you might have thought I was either unusually composed or completely detached. But the truth is that my reaction had been forged through years of being told no when my sister was always told yes, through years of learning that I could either shout myself hoarse and look ungrateful, or I could go quiet and build a kind of armor that let me stand there without cracking while people around me clapped for decisions that cut me in half. Growing up, I was the child who could not afford to slip, because my mistakes were lessons in accountability while Jenna's mistakes were opportunities for support. And I still remember the summer before college when my part-time job hours got slashed and I asked for a little help just to cover books, not tuition, not housing, just the books. And my father sat me down and said that debt builds character and a little struggle never hurt anyone. And 3 weeks later, Jenna showed up in the driveway with a new laptop and a printer because she needed it for her future, and when I raised an eyebrow, my mother told me that siblings should not keep score, and I swallowed it down because I knew the fight was lost before it started. Later, when I needed a root canal that my insurance barely covered, I was told gently that timing was tough and maybe I should work out a payment plan with the dentist, and yet in that same season Jenna decided she wanted to take a baby moon trip with her boyfriend, and somehow money appeared for airfare, hotels, and a rental car, and my parents called it a necessary investment in family bonding before the baby came, even though at that point the baby was not even a confirmed pregnancy, and when I dared to mention the double standard, I was told not to be bitter, that someday it would make sense, and that was the rhythm of my life. Watch resources shift like water in Jenna's direction, and then be told that resentment was a flaw in me, not a pattern in them. The hardest moments were not even the money, but the way they wrapped it in moral language, as if denying me help was some noble training exercise and giving Jenna everything she wanted was some virtuous act of generosity, and the more I lived it, the more I realized that arguing was like banging my head against a locked door while they insisted the door was wide open. So I stopped asking altogether, and I built my life in the spaces they left untouched, piecing together jobs, roommates, side hustles, and sheer endurance, while Jenna always had a safety net strung so tight beneath her that she never even saw the ground. When Ethan and I got serious, he noticed the pattern almost immediately, because every time my parents came up in conversation there was a kind of hitch in my voice, and when we got engaged he asked me if I thought they would contribute to the wedding. And I laughed so hard I startled him, because I knew better. I knew that if they gave me a dime it would come with a speech about responsibility and how their money was tied up in urgent obligations, which was their permanent code for Jenna's lifestyle. So we paid for our wedding ourselves, line by line, with our own savings, and when relatives assumed my parents were helping, I said nothing, because I did not want to expose the imbalance yet, not until it mattered. By the time we hit the rehearsal dinner, I already sensed something brewing, because my mother made a few offhand comments about how it is such a blessing when family resources can be pooled for the greater good. And my father joked that weddings are just one day while raising a baby is forever, and I knew those lines were not random. They were the prelude to the move they made at the reception, and that is why I kept my smile, because my whole life had trained me to expect it, and this time I had no intention of being the quiet one who went home nursing a new bruise while everyone else said what a lovely event it had been. Ethan was the only one I let into the full plan, because I knew that if I told anyone else it would leak, and sure enough, when he looked across the table at me during that announcement, I felt the kind of steadying certainty I had never had in my family. Because here was a man who had no interest in pretending that my parents were acting out of generosity, and when he reached for the envelope in his pocket later, it was not just a husband handing something over, it was a partner saying, "We see this clearly, and we are not playing by their script anymore." What my parents and Jenna did not know was that the smile I wore had been built on years of bruised silence, and that silence had finally given me enough space to prepare something they could not twist into another moral lesson. And as I sat there watching them talk about trust and fairness while other people politely clinked glasses, I thought to myself that for the first time in my life the score was about to be visible to everyone in the room, and that thought kept me calm, because once Ethan handed over that envelope, the story of who had always sacrificed and who had always taken was going to write itself right there in front of every single guest. When Ethan stood and slipped the envelope from his jacket pocket, there was a hush that moved across the room, the kind of silence that follows an unexpected shift in tone when people sense that something important is about to happen, but cannot quite place what it is. And I sat perfectly still while every eye followed him as he walked toward my parents, calm, steady, deliberate, and when he reached my mother and placed the envelope gently in her hand, she smiled in that tight, triumphant way of hers, convinced that the world had just tilted in her favor once again, convinced that all her quiet maneuvering and shameless entitlement had just delivered exactly what she believed she was owed. The strange thing about watching that moment was how familiar it felt, because I had seen that expression on her face hundreds of times before, every time Jenna received something meant to be mine. Every time I was told that my independence was my gift while Jenna's dependency was her blessing, and the guests who had applauded moments earlier now leaned in with polite curiosity, believing they were about to witness some touching family tradition, while Jenna herself was already smirking across the table as if she had won a prize before even hearing the rules, and I kept my hands folded in my lap because I knew that what sat inside that envelope was not what they thought it was, and the anticipation of watching the realization dawn on them was almost intoxicating. Ethan returned to his seat without a word, his face calm, his shoulders squared, and the moment he sat down he gave me that almost imperceptible glance that told me he was with me until the very last step. And I felt the kind of solidarity that I had never once felt growing up in that family, a solidarity that was not conditional or strategic, but rooted in the simple recognition that what my parents had been doing for years was wrong. And no amount of speeches about family values or moral high ground could disguise it anymore. My mother, clutching the envelope like it was already hers, tapped my father's arm, and he puffed up with that false dignity he uses when he believes he is about to demonstrate leadership, and he stood just slightly taller as he slid a finger under the flap. And for a second the room seemed to hold its collective breath, because even though most people had no idea what was in that envelope, they understood instinctively that the mood had shifted, and then he opened it. I watched their faces the way you watch the slow drop of a curtain at the end of a play, because the transformation was not immediate but gradual, starting with the quick blink of confusion, followed by the tightening of lips as they scanned the first page, and then the sudden stillness when they realized what they were holding, and it was not stacks of cash, it was not signed checks or notes of congratulations stuffed with bills, it was documentation, copies of transfers, highlighted records, text threads, all lined up in order, all undeniable, and for the first time in my life I saw the exact same expression of shock on both my parents' faces at the same time, and it was almost surreal. The room stayed quiet for a few long seconds, the kind of quiet that makes people shift in their seats and look around to gauge what they are supposed to be feeling, and Jenna leaned over, impatient, asking what was taking so long. And my father snapped the envelope closed so fast you would have thought he had just been handed something toxic, and my mother's hand trembled ever so slightly, but she tried to compose herself, plastering on a half-smile that fooled no one, because whispers had already started at the nearby tables, and once whispers begin at an event like that they spread faster than spilled wine. I could hear snippets. What is it? And did something happen? And they don't look happy? And I sat there, sipping my water with steady hands, because I knew this was the first crack in the performance they had maintained for decades. And no matter how quickly they tried to recover, no matter how many excuses they might attempt later, the image of them opening an envelope with absolute certainty and finding something devastating instead was burned into the memory of every guest who had witnessed it. Jenna, sensing something was wrong but not knowing what, pressed harder, demanding to see, and when my father muttered, "Not now," she frowned, loud enough for nearby relatives to hear, and her irritation only fueled the speculation. And I knew at that moment that the illusion of seamless family unity was over, because the people who had always assumed my parents were wise and fair were now watching them fumble, and the tension that hung in the air was the kind that no speech or toast could smooth away. I leaned slightly toward Ethan and whispered that the timing was perfect, and he nodded without shifting his gaze from my parents, because he understood that this was not about one envelope at one wedding reception. This was about years of being dismissed, years of being undermined, and the deliberate decision to finally make them hold their own history in their hands in front of the very people they had worked hardest to impress, and there was a deep satisfaction in knowing that they could not shred or hide those pages, not here, not now, not while the entire room watched their discomfort spread like a stain across the tablecloth. My mother finally set the envelope down beside her plate, her fingers still resting on it as though by covering it she could make the contents disappear, and she raised her chin in that stubborn way that usually shut down questions. But the murmurs had already grown too loud, and she knew as well as I did that silence would not protect her anymore, because the secret was out of her control, and in that moment, with the entire reception leaning toward the table where my parents sat red-faced and cornered, I realized that the real revenge was not even the contents of the envelope, but the simple fact that for once, they could not dictate the narrative, they could not declare what counted as fairness, and they could not convince anyone that I was the problem. I smiled again, leaned back, and thought to myself that this was only the beginning, because they still had no idea what else was coming, and I was not about to let the curtain fall just yet. The moment my parents opened that envelope and realized that what they were holding was not a bundle of cash, but a collection of printed records, receipts, and transfers that could not be spun or explained away, the atmosphere in the reception hall changed in a way that words can barely capture, because the illusion of control they had always carried like a crown slipped right off their heads, and people around them sensed it immediately, leaning in with the kind of curiosity that always flares when the polished front of a family begins to crack in public, and although no one yet knew the details, the looks on my parents' faces told the story more clearly than any explanation I could have offered. For years they had carried themselves as the arbiters of fairness, the wise elders who kept everything in balance, but those papers in their hands showed something very different, transfers that had been framed as temporary loans but never returned. Texts that proved how often I had been pressured into bailing out Jenna's crises, and records that spelled out every sacrifice I had been expected to make under the guise of family responsibility, while my sister was rescued from the consequences of her choices again and again, and suddenly the history I had been forced to live in silence was sitting in plain view for them to choke on. The whispers grew louder, because human beings are attuned to tension, and you cannot hide embarrassment in a room full of watchful eyes. So while my mother tried to fold her napkin, and my father cleared his throat with that forced authority that usually shut people down, cousins and aunts and old friends were already asking each other what could possibly be inside, and Jenna, restless and indignant, kept demanding to see for herself, which only made things worse, because every time she opened her mouth the audience of guests leaned closer, hungry for confirmation that the drama they sensed was real. I sat there without raising my voice, without making a single dramatic gesture, and yet I felt more powerful in that silence than I had in any argument we had ever had behind closed doors, because the room itself had turned against them. The polite applause of earlier replaced by suspicion, curiosity, and even faint disapproval, and my parents, who had always counted on public perception to shield them, now found that same perception becoming their enemy. My father attempted to recover, leaning toward Ethan with a stiff smile and saying something about how generous he was to provide such detailed records, but his tone wavered in that way it always did when he was cornered. And Ethan simply nodded without offering him a lifeline, because he knew as well as I did that this was not the moment to rescue them from their own mess, and instead of diffusing the tension. My father's comment only drew more attention to the envelope sitting on the table. An envelope everyone now understood contained something they were desperate to keep hidden. Jenna finally snapped, reaching for the envelope with an exasperated huff, and my mother slapped her hand away with a whispered, "Not now," which of course only fueled the curiosity. Because nothing attracts more attention than a family insisting that nothing is happening while clearly panicking, and I could see the shift in the guests' expressions as they began to connect the dots. Remembering the announcement my mother had made earlier about taking the gift money and now realizing that something was deeply wrong with the picture. I let the tension build, because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is nothing at all, and as the room grew more restless, I finally pushed back my chair, stood, and walked calmly to the microphone. And every head turned as I tapped it lightly and said that before we continued with the toasts, I wanted to take a moment to thank everyone for being here and for their generosity, because their support meant more to Ethan and me than we could ever express. And the room settled into a hush. Again, sensing that something was about to be revealed. I glanced toward my parents, who were stiff as statues, and then toward Jenna, who was still fuming. And I smiled in a way that probably looked polite to those who did not know me, but that my parents instantly recognized as the smile I wore when I was done playing their game, and I said that while we were grateful for the love and support of family. Sometimes love and support look very different depending on who you are talking to, and sometimes what gets called fairness is just a mask for favoritism. And at that point, you could hear the sharp intake of breath from the tables closest to mine, because polite wedding speeches do not usually sound like indictments. I paused long enough for the silence to stretch, then added that we had decided to handle our wedding gifts differently, to make sure nothing was lost or misused, and I wanted to thank the venue for their help in securing everything safely. Because transparency matters when money is involved, and as soon as I said the word transparency, the murmurs swelled again, because it was clear that whatever was in that envelope connected directly to what I had just said, and my parents could do nothing but sit frozen, their authority dissolving under the weight of their own history. As I looked across the room, I knew that what was coming next would not just be a simple explanation or reveal, but the dismantling of an entire narrative my parents had used for decades to paint themselves as wise and fair. And although my hands shook slightly at the thought of saying it out loud, the rush of validation from the shifting expressions in the room kept me steady, because for the first time, I was not the only one who saw the truth. I set the microphone down gently, returned to my seat, and let the silence hang heavy, because sometimes silence does the cutting more sharply than words, and as I watched my parents fumble to compose themselves, I thought, this is still only the beginning. Because the real blow has not even landed yet, and when it does, they will understand in a way they never have before that their control over me is gone for good. I picked up the microphone again and, without raising my voice or dressing anything up, I told everyone that the envelope my parents had just opened did not contain cash, because the cash from our guests was already secure, logged, and deposited directly into an account that only Ethan and I could touch, and that what they were holding instead was the history of how money had moved in our family for years under the label of temporary help and how those transfers had never come back. And I said it plainly because pretending has never protected me, and the room went still in the way rooms do when people decide they want the truth more than the performance. I said that the documents also included something new, which mattered more to me than any past dollar amount, because I had asked an attorney to draft a short agreement that did not accuse or punish, but simply set a boundary that should have existed a long time ago, and that boundary said that any gifts given to me or to my marriage belonged to me and to Ethan, and no one else, and that my parents would not solicit or accept money from me under any pretense going forward, and that if they wanted to call anything a family decision it would require my consent in writing, and I explained that if they signed it tonight I would mark every old transfer as forgiven, not because I had to, not because they deserved it, but because I wanted to start a marriage without a running ledger of old hurts. I told them there was a copy for each of them in the envelope and that I had brought pens, and I said as evenly as I could that I would rather solve this privately, here, with the people who love us watching. And that if they did not want to sign, I would respect that choice, but I would not keep doing the dance where I stay quiet and they rewrite the story later, which is why a midnight email had already been scheduled to every guest who contributed, with a gentle explanation of why the gifts were handled the way they were and a link to our account so no one would be confused by any follow-up requests, and I clarified that I hoped very much to cancel that email and keep this contained, but that my days of protecting a lie were over. Jenna tried to turn it into a scene, calling me dramatic and selfish and asking how I could do this to her baby on a night that should be about family, and I said that this was about family, just not the version where I carry the bill and swallow the speech afterward. And I reminded her that the baby did not owe anyone the mess the adults had made, and that, in fact, the last page in the packet was a receipt for a small custodial account Ethan and I had opened in the baby's name that morning, seated with a modest amount from us that no one else could touch and that would belong only to the child, because I did not come here to punish a baby, I came here to make sure the pattern stopped with me. The room shifted again, you could feel it, because people who had been clutching their forks started to breathe, and the anger that had been buzzing at the edges softened into something closer to respect. And my father looked at the pages like they were burning his hands while my mother held her jaw so tight I thought she might crack a tooth, and then Ethan stood beside me, not saying a word, just standing there like a door I could lean against. And the notary whom the venue manager had arranged at my request stepped forward quietly with a clipboard in case we needed it, because I had decided that if the moment came, I would make it simple. My mother asked if I was really going to humiliate her like this on my wedding day, and I told her calmly that they had chosen the public stage when they announced they were taking our gifts, and that all I had done was refuse to let the script play out the same way. And I added that if she signed, I would hug her, thank her, and ask the band to start the next song, and that would be the last anyone in the room ever heard about it, and if she did not, I would still dance at my own wedding with my husband and my friends, and the email would go out at midnight, and the world would keep turning while my boundaries stayed where I had finally nailed them down. There was a long stretch where no one moved, and then my father reached for the pen with a kind of deflated acceptance that I had never seen on his face, and he signed. And my mother hesitated in that way she has when she is calculating the angles. And for a second I thought she would throw the pen back at me, but she signed too, tiny letters that looked like they were trying to hide, and the notary sealed it, and the air in the room loosened like a knot pulling free, and I heard a few people exhale the way people do when a glass finally stops wobbling at the edge of a table. I thanked them into the microphone without gloating, because I did not need victory to be loud to be real, and I said that we were grateful for everyone's love and that the gifts had been honored exactly as intended. And I looked at Ethan and asked the band to play the song we picked for this moment when we imagined a room full of people who actually see us, and as we moved to the dance floor I felt a strange quiet inside me, not triumph like a parade, but something steadier. The relief that comes when you stop asking people to be different and you change the terms of your own life instead, and I knew that whatever came after this, the calls, the opinions, the fallout, it would happen on new ground that I had set, and that was enough.